Hello everyone, this is Kelli Jean from the Adult and Teen Services at the New Lenox Public Library, and we are joining in on Neurodiversity Celebration Week. So join me tonight as we look at what neurodiversity is. I share some of my own personal experiences and my journey as a neurodivergent person, and then we'll go through some tips and tricks for all neurotypes to stay organized, motivated, and get through your day. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So to start off, let's talk about neurodiversity. We have neuro for brain and diversity for differences. Therefore, all of us fall under the umbrella of neurodiversity because we all think a little bit differently. We're all wired a little bit differently. However, when people are talking about neurodiversity, they're most often referring to your neurotype. There are two that I know of. One is neurotypical, and the other is neurodivergent, which is what I am because I have a condition known as ADD. I am going to talk tonight about my experiences as a neurodivergent person, but my experiences are certainly not universal, not only to all of neurodivergent people, as there are a lot of differences that neurodivergence covers, but even to people within the same ADD category, might not share the same experiences, and I am certainly no expert or doctor. But if you are neurodivergent, I hope that today you're going to feel comforted and safe and get some tips that are going to help you. And if you're neurotypical, I certainly hope that you come away with a better understanding of what it's like for a neurodivergent person, and that you're also able to take away some of these tips to help you be more productive in your own life. So I gave a very general definition of what neurodiversity is, but these are the more formal definitions. First is individual differences in brain functioning regarded as normal variations within the human population, or the concept that differences in brain functioning within the human population are normal, and that brain functioning that is not neurotypical should not be stigmatized. So that's going to be what we're talking about today. Now that we've established what neurodiversity is, let's talk about what it means to be neurodivergent. So in the previous definition, they mentioned neurotypical. There are two neurotypes, neurotypical and neurodivergent. Neurodivergency is an umbrella of conditions that cause the brain to form or function differently, including variations in mental processes such as thought and behavior. It's important to remember that this is not a diagnosis nor a substitution for a diagnosis. And it is not a medical definition at all. And therefore, there is no one comprehensive list that lists all of the conditions that fall into this category. Furthermore, because it is not a formal diagnosis, much of the neurodivergent community is self-identified. I am among a population that is actually has received a formal diagnosis before neurodivergent kind of became a more common word. But I have found a lot of help in this community, and I know a lot of people within it have never received formal diagnosis. So you certainly don't need to have a diagnosis to be considered neurodivergent. And part of that is because there are a lot of conditions that are considered neurodivergent. And this is a graphic that just lists a couple of them, a couple of the ones that we usually are thinking about. And I've included the infinity rainbow symbol here, which covers autistic spectrum disorder and sometimes is also used for neurodivergence. And you can see it's an umbrella because there are a lot of conditions that fall underneath it. And this is by no means a comprehensive list. So as I mentioned, I have a formal diagnosis with ADD, which stands for Attention Deficit Disorder. It's very central to my identity as it affects my entire worldview. It's a part of everything I experience, and I very literally can't imagine my life without it. Now, over the years, that has become a lot of misconceptions about what ADD is and isn't. Part of that is because the language that we use to talk about it has shifted a little bit. At one point, ADD and ADHD, or attention hyperdeficit disorder, were a little bit different. And then they were one thing, but they were on a spectrum. And then one stopped existing and they couldn't decide which. I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to talk about that technical side of it, but I am going to talk a little bit about what ADD is from my experience and some of those misconceptions. So most people think of it as, ooh, shiny squirrel, or what I like to call it as magpie brain, which is certainly a part of it, but not everyone experiences those symptoms, and it's not the only part of ADD that is important. Especially for women, ADD usually looks a little bit different because inattentive ADD is more common. But the other reason is people who are doing a really good job of masking, high masking, sometimes also called high functioning, can make it harder to tell what a person with ADD actually looks like, which can help lead to more misconceptions. So, hi, I'm a person with ADD, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that means to me. So, my condition is ADD, and this is the formal definition of that: a developmental disorder that is marked especially by persistent symptoms of inattention, such as distractibility, forgetfulness, or disorganization, some of which we're going to talk about tonight, or by symptoms of hyperactivity and impulsivity, such as fidgeting, speaking out of turn, or restlessness, or by symptoms of all three that is not caused by any serious underlying physical or mental disorder. I also pulled part of the note from the definition here, and I did not include all of it, but I really liked what it said here, which kind of talked about what I was referring to when I was saying that there are some debates as to whether or not ADD and ADHD are the same thing or part of same whole. So this note says, while hyperactivity and impulsivity are not always present as symptoms, inattention deficit disorder is commonly referred to as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So that is where we get the H in ADHD. I usually use ADD for myself, not only because I think it's more accurate, but because I think ADHD is a little clunkier to say. So some problem areas for people with ADD, the big one is executive dysfunction. Now, as I mentioned, not everyone experiences this, but if you talk to people with this condition, this is usually the main thing that people are talking about. And executive function is your decision-making processes. So big problem areas are focus and memory, organization, impulsivity, motivation, and another one for me is perfectionism or all or nothing attitude. So those are going to be some specific things that I try to address today, and giving you techniques and tips and tricks in order to get a handle on coping with those problems. You're going to notice a couple of things that I mentioned for problem areas in that definition, such as memory, disorganization, impulsivity. So let's just review the ones that we're going to target tonight. Focus and memory, organization, impulse control, motivation and productivity, and perfectionism and burnout. So before I get into some of these coping mechanisms and strategies, I just want to mention something that comes up a lot, especially in my professional life. People will hear about the things that I'm doing or look at some of the strategies that I have, particularly at work, and they'll be like, oh, you're so organized. And I'm like, no, I'm not. That's why I have these strategies. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, wow, that's all way too much, I would never be able to do that, or I feel intimidated by that, don't worry about it. First of all, it's not for everyone. What works for me might not work for you. But also starting something new might be helpful for you. And know that I am not perfect either. And these strategies that I know are helpful are not things I always succeed in actually accomplishing. So now that we've had some honesty and transparency, let's start by looking at ways we can cope with focus and memory. Our first category is focus and memory. Now, the biggest one for me with both focus and memory is taking notes. And this is twofold. First of all, the act of taking notes can help us to code our memories by having kind of 2 or 3 things happening at once. We have the auditory, verbal instruction. We have our notes that we can refer back to if we need to have our memory checked, but also as we're using the kinesthetic, actually physically writing, that can help to code our memories. But also just doodling or writing something down, even if it's not something that you're going to refer to, can help you stay engaged and focused when it's easy to get fidgety or have a difficult time focusing. So I like to take notes whenever possible. For important information, I almost always take notes on my laptop or phone. I like to take digital notes over physical ones. And if I'm not able to take physical notes, or excuse me, if I'm not able to take digital notes and I'm at an important meeting, especially for work, I like to take time after this meeting in order to copy my notes over and digitize them. It's important for me to schedule this step so that everything is fresh. And when possible, I try to block it out in my schedule, or at least mentally give myself about a 15-minute time period afterward to review my notes and write them down and digitize them. This also gives me a chance to move my sometimes scrambled notes into a more organized format. And I really like that it makes it searchable as well when it is digital instead of just my messy handwriting. When I'm going into an important meeting or even something like a sermon or a lecture, I like to have a handout or agenda handy so that I can keep track of time. This helps with my time blindness. And then it also gives me something to write on and add notes to, and it gives me a structure, all of which are good. Next for focus is going to be timers. And for memory is going to be reminders. And for both of them, it's breaks. So the easiest thing to do for reminders is to set up alarms and reminders through avenues that you already use, such as your phone or calendar. If you don't currently have a system, I use Google Calendar because I use Google for most other things. And that's something that works for me. I'm going to talk a little bit about Google Drive in a moment, but I like to have everything kind of on the same platform. That way I don't have to go back and check a lot of things and get distracted as I'm flipping between things. So I try to limit the number of clicks I have to do in order to set things up. That's why my phone is also really good for alarms and reminders. I already engage with that. I don't have to download anything new. I can just use the system as is. If you are working on something, it's a good idea to set up specific time blocks or for tasks and breaking them down into steps or sections. A good way to do this is, again, in your calendar. And if you set up time blocks for specific tasks, it's kind of a form of the Pomodoro technique. The Pomodoro technique formally is 25 minutes of work and then 5 minutes of break. And then you repeat this ad nauseum until you either complete the task or you do it a number of times and then you take a longer break. I've done a form of this technique before. I've never really done 25-5 religiously, but I have done 45-15, or as I mentioned, I'd like to schedule time for notes after a meeting. So I try to keep those more on the 45s or so that I can keep everything organized by time, and I can be aware of time blindness. Another method, which is just sort of a modification, is to keep a calendar that has all of your tasks in it and giving a time estimate. Now, for me, part of my time blindness, for those who are not familiar with the term, time blindness just means that I am really bad at acknowledging the passing of time. So if you ask me if it's been 5 minutes or 5 hours, I will likely not know the answer. But I also am a really bad estimator of how long a task is going to take because of that time blindness. I don't necessarily remember how long the task took previously because I wasn't really paying attention or I was having a hard time tracking it anyway. So that can make my estimations not great. By blocking out time in a physical location, like on a calendar or even a digital calendar, if I need to make modifications to that time, I have it actually recorded somewhere. And then for the next time, I'm going to have a better idea of how long that task actually took versus what I thought it was going to take. And I can schedule better in the future. So if you are interested in trying the Pomodoro technique, there are some apps that you can use. The Pomodoro technique has a web app, which means that you can pull it up on your screen and put it next to whatever you're working on. And you can just type it in. It's going to be Pomodoro. And that works right on your computer as long as you have Wi-Fi. So you don't need to download anything or add it anywhere. However, if you like to download things because you prefer to have things on your phone and come with you, there are some apps that are similar that are going to track your time in order to help make you more aware of the passage of time and how long you are spending on tasks. One of them is Forest. Forest is good because it's a form of gamification, which is something we'll refer to quite a bit in this presentation. As you stay focused, the longer you stay focused, the more the little trees on your phone grow. So if that's something that's novel and interesting to you, that can be a great way to get engaged. And something that's a little bit more professional is going to be Toggle Track. And both of those are available as mobile apps. So the reason I keep talking about modifying this method is one of the paradoxes of ADD is we do struggle with focus, but occasionally we get into a particular flow that's often called hyperfocus, or if it's something that we're really passionate about or interested in, we can become hyperfixated. And that is like the opposite. And I'm still time blind in that, but instead of me not knowing how long tasks are taking and thinking that time is going by really slow, I don't realize how much time I've spent in one particular area, which can lead me to not manage my time well, ignore other tasks, miss deadlines or meetings, things like that. So I try to take advantage of my hyperfocus when I have blocks of time that I'm able to. So when I think of the strict 25-5 technique, that wouldn't necessarily work for me. I would need to allow myself to skip certain breaks in order to capitalize on that function and on that focus when I have it, rather than letting it get away from me by taking a break. And part of that is I have a really hard time with transitions. So it's better for me to get into something and stay in it until I'm at a logical breaking point. But that's just going to depend on each person. If this sounds appealing to you, I recommend you look into it. The other thing for focus that I really recommend is if you have ADD in particular, you're going to be distracted. The best thing to do is just to acknowledge that and address it if you can in order to move on. This is kind of similar to the way meditation is done. It's not that you're not allowed to have thoughts, you're just supposed to acknowledge them and let them go. I don't do great with that with meditation, but acknowledging my distractions and addressing them when I can really does make a difference. That doesn't always mean that I'm naming the distraction or going and doing something about it right at that moment. It's just sort of giving myself the mental focus instead of thinking about 3 things and splitting my brain. I just give myself a moment to think, okay, this is what's distracting me, put all of my focus on it, decide if there's anything I can do. And if not, I can try to move on from there because I've acknowledged it. That doesn't always work. Usually addressing it is the best thing to do, but that's not always going to be within our control. Sometimes when it's not within our control, if it's a condition, say, of the office, then that acknowledgement will have to be verbal in order to take action on it. So just kind of figure out how distracting something actually is and how to deal with it, and try to work with people around you in order to make that accommodation. All right, this is my favorite example for memory, and that is linked tasks. This works really well for me, especially physical links. So what that means is I just take tasks that need doing and I pair tasks I struggle with tasks that I am already doing well. So in a physical link, what that means is I have a terrible time carrying a purse or a wallet. If I try to carry a purse or wallet, I will leave it behind. I've tried different types of wallets. I've tried different types of purses. It doesn't seem to matter. If it is not either on my person or physically linked to something else important, it's going to get left behind. So what I do is I have my phone is my wallet. So I have a sticky wallet, but I've also used the kind where you have a fabric wallet that just has room for your phone in it. I like the sticky wallet because I'm able to use it regardless of the size of my phone, and I don't have to worry about the case. So I've physically linked my phone and my wallet, because not only am I not going to go anywhere without my phone, but I'm much more likely to realize it's missing early on when I'm able to go back for it. So I'm not going to get home from a restaurant and 6 hours later, it's 3 a.m, the restaurant is closed, and I realize I don't have my wallet. Because when I get home, about 10 minutes in, I'm going to notice if I don't have my phone. So keeping those links really works for me. Another example of physical links, I worked with somebody who had a hard time remembering their lunchbox after work. So when they came in to work, they put their car keys in their lunchbox and then put their lunchbox in the fridge. That way they never left without their car keys because they physically couldn't, and they never left without their lunchbox because they were physically linked. Some more abstract, so those are very literal examples. Actually sticking things together or putting something inside of something else. A more abstract way of thinking of physical links would be to put items you need near items you are already taking, or near the door, your shoes, your keys. That way you have a visual cue that you need to take those items with you, and that they're right by there as you get out the door. Mental links goes back to what I was talking about, which is pairing something you do well with something you struggle with. So that can be with chores, tasks, anything you need to get done. If you pair something you enjoy with something you don't enjoy as much, it's going to be easier to get both of those tasks done. Or if there's something you're already doing really successfully, then you can build on that by adding something to it and seeing if you can grow that habit. Another mental link would be more of a routine. And for me, I am not a morning person. If I try to set up a routine or something that I have to do in the morning, it's never going to get done, and I'm going to be really frustrated. And I'm really susceptible to decision fatigue at that moment. So the time that works better for me is the evening. So if I pick a time that I do a task, then I mentally link that time with that task or routine, and then I can set myself reminders in order to set it up. And I recommend finding a time that works for you. Night is ideal for me and my schedule. A lot of people prefer morning routines, but just setting up things that are links in order to kind of think about pulling them up one at a time, a link at a time, then you're going to accomplish two things at once. And that's going to be a great burst of satisfaction too. All right, next for focus in particular is going to be managing sensory processing. Now, for whatever reason, I did not know that sensory processing was a part of ADD until my adulthood. Now, looking back, I have 100 examples where I can tell you that I was definitely having sensory processing issues. For one, in first grade, because I refused to wear shoes and socks and took them off all the time, I was referred to as Cinderella. I still don't like to wear socks, but it just never occurred to me that that was part of my ADD. So it's something that I've learned much more recently. And so my tips for this are a little bit more general, as I am still figuring it out. But again, in general, control what input you can and regulate your output. So your input is going to be noise. For me, I usually, when I'm trying to focus, will put on a headphone and keep one on to muffle and one off so that I can stay engaged with what I'm doing. I have recently purchased some earplugs. I really like this brand. It's called Loops. It's by no means an endorsement, but it's just a brand that has worked really well for me, because what they tout is they have this acoustic loop on it in order to just sort of muffle background noises without muffling closer contact. So it helps weed out all of that background noise while letting me stay focused and engaged in what's in front of me. An example of a time that that's good for would be I have 7 nieces and nephews. Sometimes that gets really loud and I'm not able to have an adult conversation. So if I put my headphones in, I'm able to get rid of some of that background noise. It makes me much more calm and comfortable. I don't feel as moody and I'm able to have a better conversation. So that is definitely something that has worked for me. Another input would be lighting. I recommend in your home, if you can, having areas of both high and low light for when you need it. Now, when you're out, that's going to be harder to control, as lighting is usually something you can't have that much input on. In your office, it might be something that you have to ask for an accommodation for. And then the other big aha moment for sensory processing for me was clothing. So I recently pretty much completely redid my closet, and I got only clothes that made me feel good. And that may seem obvious, but what really wasn't. So controlling my clothing and finding stuff that feels good on my skin and makes me feel good in my skin was really important. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not much of a morning person. So by updating my clothing, I was also able to limit decision fatigue in the morning because I chose a lot of dresses, which worked for me. And that way I'm only making one decision in the morning, which is which dress am I wearing, rather than several choices when I'm doing separates or layers. All right. For output, stimming is something that a lot of people naturally do when they're dealing with regulating their sensory processing. And that can look different for different people. I don't have a particular stim that I lean towards or that I notice, but some people have some different kinds that might be tapping or some examples. More common one is going to be your sensory or fidget toys. Now, something to keep in mind with fidget toys is they're not just for kids. They can be really important for adults to help regulate, to make you feel good, and to give you something to do with your hands and occupy your mind. This works for me. Having just something in my hand to be doing can help satisfy that part of my brain that is distracted in order to help me focus the other part of my brain on whatever task I'm doing. Another recommendation would be flex desks or seating, such as a standing desk or a pedal desk, where you're able to have sort of regulated output. You can decide how much you want to put into that. A really important one for any person, but particularly those who are neurodivergent, is mindfulness. And part of that would also be sleep hygiene, which can really make a difference in regulating your output. The last thing I want to mention is that we do have fidget toys and sensory toys available at the Adult and Teen Services Desk. So if you are in the library and you are feeling overstimulated, or you just need something to help you monitor your output and deal with your sensory processing, we have some available. Additionally, we have some fidget spinners that were made in our studio on our 3D printer, and those are available this week as part of Neurodiversity Celebration Week. But stay tuned, because in April, our studio will be doing a make your own fidget spinner for all ages. That includes adults and teens, to make more of those and to help lower stigma as well. All right, my next tip is about emails and texts, and that's using the boomerang or send later function. That way you can schedule emails and texts. You can use this in 2 ways. One of them is to use as reminders, so you can set them up to send later so that you receive them again. And that way it's kind of your past self talking to your future self. But this can also be used when you're feeling distracted and you have anxious thoughts or intrusive thoughts that you need to deal with before you're going to be able to get back to what you're doing. This allows you to address those issues, as I said, acknowledge the distraction and move on, while communicating at what is going to be more appropriate times with other people. And that way you can also get a little burst of satisfaction because you're going to know that that task has been accomplished and handled. You can kind of check off that box, get a little bit of dopamine, and that can actually help you not only because it takes it off your plate mentally, but it gives you a little boost as you continue to work on what you're working on. All right, moving on to organization. So the first thing I mentioned was notes, and that I really like to take digital notes. Part of the reason for that is not only that they're searchable, not only that I can refer back to them and that they're neat and organized, they also help me to avoid clutter. If it were up to me, I write so many little notes and lists and things to keep me focused and engaged. If I don't get rid of those pieces of paper or move important information onto my phone or computer, I will have a paper apocalypse. And every surface in my house and office will be covered in papers. So utilizing digital organization makes a huge difference for me. As I mentioned, digital files are just way easier to search and refer to. And there's lots of different options depending on your needs and learning preferences. So for me, I do really well with spreadsheets, outlines, and list format, which is a little bit more standard for something like Google Drive, where I can use docs and sheets. But a lot of neurodivergent people are very visual. And so you can use something like Jamboard, which is going to be a digital whiteboard that is still part of the Google Drive family, or MindNode, which is specifically set up to be more of a mind map and a visual way of processing information. Now, for people with ADD, we often also have issues with auditory processing. So as if it wasn't bad enough that our memory is not great, sometimes just getting that verbal information to begin with is really challenging. But other people respond really well to having auditory information. So I do really well with audiobooks and voice notes. But if I want to make them searchable, I need to get that voice down on paper anyway. You can try to use speech notes. If you prefer audio, you can change it from text to voice. But if you are going to a lecture or a seminar, or you're just in a meeting and you want that information down on paper, you can also use speech notes in order to take that voice down to text as a form of dictation. All right, so here's just some examples of how I use Google Drive to make lists, to make charts, to make records of things.
Another reason that I prefer Google Drive is that it is accessible from anywhere. Since I'm prone to forget things like my phone or wallet, or even my laptop, if I have the things on Google Drive, regardless of what device I have access to, I am able to access all my information and refer back to it. So I like that it is across all devices, regardless of what else is going on. Additionally, I like that it auto saves. Again, as someone who tends to forget either to save it or might not notice the charge as it's going down and end up with a dead laptop in the middle of a project, having things that auto save and are accessible from anywhere is really important. And it just is a reason that I prefer Google Drive to other similar note taking apps.
And here's what Jamboard and MindNode look like. So this is an example where I've used the sticky notes to make a meal plan. All right, I do pretty well with digital organization, which is ideal for my career, but I definitely have a harder time with physical organization. It's just something that's always been really difficult for me to cope with. So as I mentioned, the first way that I deal with that is by trying to make as much of my life digital as possible. But that's just not going to work for everything. So the trap that we are trying to avoid is sometimes referred to in neurodivergent circles as doom boxing. Doom boxing is when you take an item and if it doesn't have a particular home or you don't want to deal with it right now, you put it away in a place like a box, and then you put it away and you never think about it again. It's sort of like having a lot of junk drawers. If I'm not careful, my car can become a doom box because I have difficulty with transition. So it can make me really blind to the items in there, or I feel like I don't have the energy to deal with them in the moment. So then the mess and the clutter grows and grows and grows. So doom boxing, it's sort of an object permanency issue. So how do we avoid it? Some things that I do is I only use containers that I can see into. So I use a lot of wire containers and acrylic containers. That way I can see the items. I have a visual map and a visual memory of what I'm searching for. If you don't like the way that those look, another way that you can deal with that is to make sure that whatever containers you're using are clearly labeled. Now, not everything in your life is going to go in a container, so just make sure that all of your items have a specific and defined space that they go back to. Think of it as every item has a home. I also recommend keeping items that you use often in areas of high traffic or visibility in order to overcome that object constancy, in order to not forget that things exist. This is another way of preventing yourself from becoming the person that your math teacher warned you about. An example would be if I bought a bag of onions, I brought it home, I put it in my pantry on the bottom shelf, and I closed the door, walked away. Next time I'm at the grocery store, I'm getting something else. I think, oh yeah, this recipe has onions in it. And I buy a bag of onions and I bring it home. And now I have 2 bags of onions. And then a few days later, I go out again and I now have, unbeknownst to me, 3 bags of onions because I forgot I had the first 2. So let's try to avoid that. Part of it is also going to be food waste later, and I'll talk about impulsivity and my challenges at the grocery store in a few slides. So how do we handle that? First of all, my biggest suggestion is try not to be overwhelmed by an all or nothing attitude. Sometimes the task can seem so daunting because you want to do everything at once, or you don't even know where to start. So I try to do a 10-minute tidy, which is when I set my alarm. And so this is using techniques we talked about. I give myself a specific block of time, 10 minutes, to handle a specific task. That usually starts with visible clutter, unless I have a specific job I need to do that day or week. And then when that timer is done, I am done. If I have a little bit of hyper focus and I'm able to keep going, I feel like I have enough energy, what is also sometimes referred to as spoons. If I have enough to keep going, I give myself the option of doing that. But if I'm anxious or panicking and I don't feel good about continuing, I let myself stop there and just acknowledge what has been done. If you are interested in the 10-minute tidy technique, it is also referenced in this month's version of the Leisurely Librarian, which you guys can pick up at the library as part of our spring cleaning checklist. Another way to do this is to divide your home into quadrants or rooms and just tackle one portion, or divide your work into specific tasks and then only work on one specific task. That way you're not getting caught up in the, if I don't do everything, then it's not worth doing anything. All right, so one of the most successful things that I have done in my own home in order to stay organized is my pantry. So I just wanted to show you guys a picture of this. As you can see, I use a lot of clear acrylic containers. I have wire containers, and the things that are dark, like my spices, which need to stay away from light and heat, those are in tins, but they are all clearly labeled, and they're also usually sorted in a particular order by cuisine. That way I can keep track of what I have. Another thing that really works well for me, so what used to be in this room was the same number of shelves, but it was oriented different and they were really deep. So it was easy to lose track of what I had, because if an item was 3 or 4 cans deep, it was not in my visual field at all. It was not in my sight line, and it was not something I was going to know I had. So these shelves are longer but they're much shallower, so I can keep track of what I have. And then I try to do things by height also, so that it's easier to keep track of. All right, so now that I've talked about the pantry, I'm going to talk about my grocery store nightmares. The grocery store is just a really hard place for me. It is my ADD nightmare. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them, which is the core of this topic, is impulse control. I will go into the grocery store wanting one item, and I will come out of the grocery store with 20 items and not the item that I went in there for. So this is a trap for me for impulsivity for sure. And another thing that will happen with that impulsive buying strategy is I will buy things that seem novel or interesting or something I want to try. And I won't think about how those items fit together. And I'll get home and I'll have, $100 worth of groceries that don't make a single meal because none of those things go together. So that's the first big trap. Is it's definitely impulsivity. But the other problems I have with grocery stores, they're often sensory nightmares because they're really loud, they're full of people, the lighting is terrible. And then the last thing is going back to that decision fatigue. There are usually many options for every kind of thing in the grocery store. I once had a mental breakdown in the condiment aisle because there were just too many kinds of mustard and I didn't know which one I needed or even wanted. So grocery stores are a place that I try to avoid. One of the ways that I am able to help with this impulse control in regards to the grocery store is by not only making a list and a plan, but by using a grocery app. I lower my impulse buying by ordering my groceries ahead of time. That way I am forced to stick to a list. I don't have any kind of marketing traps as I walk through the aisles. And I'm able to avoid some of those more triggering situations. Now, many stores have their own websites and mobile apps for ordering, but those that can't be ordered, those that don't, can be ordered through third parties like Instacart. Where I live now, it is free for me to do my list and have somebody bring it out to my car. Where I lived before, there was a small fee, I think $5 per, that went to the person who packed your groceries. And for me, that was worth it because it saved me money in the long run. I would rather pay someone $5 to make me stick to my list than me go in and spend an extra $50. And this is also a way of staying organized. Some of these apps have built-in meal plans that you can just click and add all the ingredients to your cart. But you can also kind of DIY your own meal kits this way as you're making a list and having other people deliver them to you. I use the pickup where I drive to the store and they put it in my trunk. But many of these stores also have just regular delivery, which can be really helpful if you have any accessibility or mobility issues as well. So what I was referring to earlier with being okay with spending $5 to save $50 is often referred to as the ADD tax. So this is just sort of a colloquial term. And that refers to the additional emotional and financial costs due to symptoms and traits of ADD or ADHD. Some examples of that would be paying fees for missed bills or deadlines, wasting food, especially produce, because it goes bad before you remember that you have it, or you put it in a drawer and it became a doom box. Something that has taken a lot of work for me is unintentional subscription payments. Maybe you sign up for a trial and you forget to cancel it in time, or it's a yearly subscription, and so you don't remember it until it's already gone through again, and it's not even something that you're using. Another one would be impulsive or under-researched purchases. And then, of course, losing or forgetting items and buying them twice. So in addition to the literal cost, though, many of these items also come with the cost of shame and guilt. And then they also often have a time cost. So consider the example I gave with the onions. Now, I know that I'm never going to use 3 bags of onions in time for them to all still be good. So I am going to have some food waste, and that will be a financial loss. And once I lose that, then I have to pay for those items again to replace the ones that have gone bad. So when you're thinking about the ADD tax, another example other than the grocery delivery would be to use vegetables that are pre-cut and washed. Would you rather pay someone a small charge for labor in order to get an item that you're actually going to use, or pay not only for the item itself, but pay for it again when it goes back? One thing that is ADD friendly, in case you guys did not know, New Lenox Public Library is a fine-free library. What that means is that there are no late fees for most of our material. That does not apply to our tech to go, and after a certain amount of time, the items will be considered lost. But you don't have to worry about returning your books and having overdue fines. If you are overdue, don't be ashamed. Just come in and drop it off. I know lots of stories of people who have been kept out of their libraries from this ADD tax, from that guilt and shame that they feel about having things that are overdue. If you're like me and you drive around with the library books in your car and you drive right past the library and you still never drop it off, don't be ashamed. Just bring it in. We don't care. We just want the book back. And we want to see your face in the library. So hopefully, if you did not know that, that is something that helps make us a more safe space for you. All right, still talking about impulse control. The main thing comes down to just learning to wait. Now, my example for the grocery store, that was an example of how to limit my time and access to a place that is kind of a trap for me, somewhere I have more trouble. But not everywhere that you have impulse control issues are places that you can avoid. So when you need to go somewhere, try to have a plan or a list with you and do your best to stick with it. If you are having more of a particular impulse for an action or a purchase that's not quite in one of these pick it up as you go scenarios, but something that you're wanting to act on, that you have a little bit more time and space to think about, try to identify what your needs or wants are and what the underlying emotions are that is causing you to want that thing. Then address them in other ways if you can. Or decide if whatever you're being impulsive about is actually impulsive and if it's healthy for you or not. Similarly, if it's something that you're debating, especially with purchases, try to sleep on it. Wait a day, a week, a month, and check in with yourself and see if you still want or need that item or action. See if it still feels relevant and good to you. You can also use this as a way to set up rewards to practice delayed gratification, which I'm going to talk a lot about rewards next, because that is a thing that often really works well for people with ADD. So here's an example. I just put some stuff up of ways that I lower my food waste and pay a little bit of ADD tax in order to make sure that items get used. So I lower my food waste by buying foods that are less labor intensive, such as these peeled baby carrots, or having long shelf or freezer life. This crushed ginger that I use, for example, the pop-out ginger, is both. It has a really long freezer life, but it also saves me a lot of labor in trying to mince ginger, which I just think takes too long. All right, now we're on to motivation. There are two really big topics in motivation for ADD. The first one is gamification. And what that is just learning how to make things fun. We respond well to things that feel like a challenge, something that we're interested in or novel. So turning tasks into challenges or even thinking of them as like side quests often works really well. Now that can be personal challenges to yourself, or you can bring in a partner for accountability and try to compete with one another. If you don't have someone physically in your life, like if you don't have someone that you live with that you can do this with, there are lots of communities online that run different challenges, and you can often find ways of doing this and sharing that with other members of the neurodivergent community. Some examples of that are approaching tasks as how many can I do? How long can I keep up my streak? How fast can I get this done? And then using visuals like charts, lists, or sticker boards to keep track of those goals and your accomplishments can also help. So those are another way of gamifying things because you're able to see how you're doing. Goes back to keeping my streak. I have two particular apps that you can use. But if you want to go just analog, you can easily use the poster board approach or use a journal. And if you bullet journal, you can have a habit tracker in there. If you are looking for a mobile app, the two that I have used are Finch. Finch, I like, it's kind of similar to the Forest app I mentioned before. It is mainly used as a mindfulness app, but you can sort of adjust the tasks that you put into it in order to make it work better for you. The idea, though, is every time you accomplish a task, and since self-care is so important to every person, and especially those with neurodivergence, you can kind of integrate those. Every time you accomplish a task, whether that's mindfulness, journaling, or one of the chores that you need to get done, you're caring for this little tiny bird and you're watching it grow up. And for me, turning it into something that is outside of myself rather than just an intrinsic motivation really does work well for me. If you're looking for more like an RPG style, Habitica is a great way of turning your tasks into side quests. So here are some visual examples of gamifying your life. So if you need to get some chores done, why not turn it into a bingo board? And then every time you complete a bingo, you can give yourself some kind of reward. Or if you are looking for something a little bit more professional, you can also just use a standard habit tracker, but you can keep it interesting and novel if you use fun stickers or colors or markers that you really enjoy. All right, and those are forms of rewards. Now, the most obvious form of reward is material. I did this huge project at work and it took me months and months and months, and now I'm going to take a vacation and I'm going to go on a cruise. Or, hey, I had a really hard time brushing my teeth this morning, but I got it done, and now that that's done, I'm going to reward myself to a coffee or something like that. And when we think of material rewards, those are also a really great way to keep practicing your impulse control, because you can set them up as rewards for goals that you need to accomplish over time. So you can work towards items that you want rather than just running out and going and grabbing them. You should also not underestimate the power of immaterial rewards. It's important to just take a moment to acknowledge your accomplishments and give yourself praise. That in and of itself is a reward, and it's something that we often have a hard time doing. Now, there is a motivation strategy that's sometimes called eat the frog, which means tackle the biggest thing first thing and then work your way down. There's mixed research about how that is for neurodivergent people. For me, again, going back to the number of spoons or the amount of energy I have in the day, if I expend too many of my spoons up front, the rest of my day, I'm never going to recover. So using that eat the frog or avalanche method doesn't usually work great for me. But if I snowball tasks, start with something small, remind myself that I'm capable, that I can do it, taking a moment to acknowledge my accomplishments and give myself praise, then I've had an immaterial reward for a small thing, and I can work on my next thing and do it again and work my way up. And that can often help sustain me through it rather than trying to work my way from big to small. I prefer to work from small to big. Another thing that you can do for immaterial rewards is incorporate your self-care, whether this is just giving yourself more time for mindfulness or a hobby, and kind of blending those two things together. I also want to mention hobbies and interests here, because a lot of people with ADD will get hyperfixations, or during that time when they're working on a hobby, they'll try to turn it into a side hustle. That then is not self-care. That becomes work 2.0, and you've lied to yourself about it. So now you're also not in a great mental state. Make sure whatever hobbies or interests that you're pursuing are actually working for you, and that they are giving you the satisfaction and reward that you want out of them. When you're done with something and you want to move on, don't feel guilty. Maybe you'll end up coming back to that thing, but don't feel like you need to push through because you don't want to abandon a hobby because you've just made yourself another chore. All right, which leads us into perfectionism and burnout, part of routines and habits. So I already mentioned my main thing for this is remembering linked tasks. They're the best thing that I have for setting up routines, because routines and habits are really hard for any person, but they are doubly hard if you have ADD. So I try to limit my decision fatigue by limiting my options. I mentioned my clothing change. I also got rid of all of my socks and just bought one type of sock in many versions of it. Sorry, one version of my sock and got many of them. That way, no matter what sock I pulled out in the morning, it was going to match the next one that I pulled out. And that way I was able to limit my decision fatigue. And then I realized that part of my sensory processing, I really hate socks. And I went and got some of those washable insoles and bought shoes that I didn't have to wear socks in, that were still professional and were still useful. So I now only use my socks when I'm doing things that are active that I need my gym shoes for. So that's a way that I limited my decision fatigue. If you have a lot of things to consider, try to give yourself only 2 options, even if you really realistically have more than 2 options. Narrow down your thought process to only look at those 2 options in order to help limit your fatigue. Find ways to keep your habits interesting and novel while you still accomplish what you need to do. So one of the problems with routines and habits is that they can get really boring, and then they're even harder to accomplish than they were in the first place. So finding ways to change things up or find enjoyment from them is nice. So maybe trying a different scent of deodorant, or using different kinds of garbage bags or something like that just keeps it novel. Or, as I mentioned, finding clothes, for example, getting clothes as part of your routine. I know night is better for my routine, so I want to set my clothes out the night before, but picking out clothes that I'm excited about that help me get up and get dressed in the morning is another way that I can incorporate those into my routine while still feeling good. And this is the biggest tip. Remember that broken habits are better than no habits at all. It's better to get started on something, fail, and start over than to just never get started, because the longer you wait, the harder it's going to be to start. And that big ball of guilt and shame is only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So start with a habit that might not even be a habit. It's just the first time that you accomplish a task, and then reward yourself if you're able to do it again and again and again. And then when you fail, that's okay. Pick yourself up and start over when you remember that you need to do it again, or when you realize that that task has stopped working for you. If it stopped serving you, try to find a better way of tackling it. All right. Similarly, how do we overcome negative emotions when we feel them? People with ADD often also have something called RSD, which is rejection sensitive dysphoria. Now, every person in the universe tends to remember things that are negative more than they remember things that are positive. That's just the way we're wired. But this is another example where it is worse when you have ADD. And that rejection, or perceived rejection is really the important part, can weigh on us in a way that it just doesn't affect other people. And so having a strategy for dealing with your negative emotions is important. Allow yourself to feel it, and then give yourself grace to move through it. Make your self-care a priority in your routine. Improve your sleep hygiene, and use your hobbies for that purpose. Once again, make sure that they still serve you. A big one for me is practicing saying no. I'm a big people pleaser. I don't do great with boundaries. So if I practice saying no in smaller settings, it is easier for me to set bigger boundaries later. A great way to overcome perfectionism in particular is to invite a friend over. And there's kind of 3 P's that I have listed here. One is pressure, perspective, and parallel play. So pressure is just another way of saying accountability, and accountability is a form of gamification at best. Now, at worst, accountability can be a shame-driven motivator, which is not exactly healthy, but is going to get your stuff done in the short term. And if you just need to get over the hump, I think we've all been there. So just physically inviting someone over almost always is a great way to make sure my house is cleaned. That's not exactly a healthy motivator, but it is a motivator. Having somebody that I can be honest with, that I can just be accountable with, also gives me a more realistic idea of my goals and how I'm going to accomplish them. Since rejection-sensitive dysphoria is so prevalent with ADD, perspective is another reason you might want to invite a friend over when you are feeling burnt out or struggling with perfectionism, because they're going to offer a perspective where they're going to be able to see more of the positive things, and they're going to help you realize when you are being overly negative and not actually seeing reality. And then the last one would be parallel play. I have play in parentheses because it doesn't have to be play. This can work really well for any kind of task that you need done, whether that's going out to an appointment you don't want to go to, or going to a store that you have difficulty with impulse control, or sitting at your computer and just getting something accomplished. Parallel play just means that you have somebody in the room with you working on their own thing while you work on yours. So that's another way of having kind of accountability and positive pressure. Now, they don't have to be working on the same thing that you are, and they don't have to engage with you. Just physically having somebody there can help to keep you engaged and on the level. Now that I've shared some strategies and tips with you, I just want to take a moment to just talk about my personal experience and my story. I was extremely lucky to have 2 very loving and concerned parents who went and got me diagnosed when I was very young. But because they were concerned about issues of stigma and me feeling different, they did not disclose that diagnosis to me until I was in high school. They were afraid of me being treated different or feeling different. And I appreciate the love and concern that went into that decision. That being said, receiving a formal diagnosis was so helpful to learning to manage. It helped me be more patient with myself and have a better understanding of my own perspective. In addition, I was able to find a community of people with similar experiences. Furthermore, my ADD did pretty well in school. I was very high masking due to the structure, and the lack of structure can be really taunting. So I had a much harder time transitioning into adulthood and independent living than I did in school, which is when most people are receiving their diagnosis and support. I know that navigating would have been way more difficult if I didn't understand what I was going through. So if anything I'm saying tonight is resonating with you and you're considering whether or not to go and try to receive a diagnosis, I encourage you to make the decision that feels the best for you. But for me, knowing and being able to look up research and connect with people like me really has made a difference in my life and my coping skills and just my general health. Another thing to be aware of is something called comorbidity. And that's basically the presence of more than one condition or diagnosis that is simultaneously present. Now, for me, I have ADD, and I have its 2 very common friends, which are anxiety and depression. These are comorbid mental health conditions that are often present in ADD and sometimes in other forms of neurodivergence as well. So if anything that I'm talking about really is resonating with you, I encourage you to look into speaking with someone. And just know that each journey is unique, and not everyone likes labels, and that's okay. But finding someone you can trust, whether or not that's a professional, whether that's just a friend, can be really helpful, especially if you are looking for a community. Now, this week, as we continue to highlight resources and programs, the main thing I want people to take away from this program and from Neurodiversity Celebration Week is that everyone thinks different, whether they identify as neurodivergent or not. So let's learn to be more patient with each other, with our needs, with our differences. Let's destigmatize the need for assistance, whether that's accommodations, devices, or just learning to ask for help. And let's all try to make an attitude adjustment. Thank you.